Why do we keep fighting each other? It's a question that echoes through time, through ancient ruins, peace treaties etched into marble, and even the chaotic whirlwind of social media debates today. We call ourselves modern, enlightened, civilized, and yet conflict continues to erupt, both on a grand scale and in the quiet corners of everyday life. Why is that? Why do the same societies that build libraries and cathedrals also stockpile weapons? Why do people, even in times of peace, find themselves turning friends into foes and strangers into threats? It's not just about countries at war or leaders waging battles. The instinct to fight runs deeper than politics. It's something woven into the human experience. Contrary to how we like to see it, war isn't some glitch in the system, something that only appears when everything else goes wrong. It's much more fundamental than that. War reflects something ancient inside us, a psychological force shaped by both our biology and the societies we've built over thousands of years. From tribal bands to sprawling empires to online flame wars, the impulse to battle hasn't vanished. It's just taken on new forms. The battlefield itself may have moved from the wilderness to the digital arena, but the same logic of conflict still hums underneath. It moves quietly, hiding beneath everyday actions, shaping how we treat each other, how we define us and them. This video takes a bold stance. War isn't just a product of politics or economics. It's a recurring symptom and expression of unconscious forces that stretch across centuries and cultures. These forces are driven by fear, by a desire for control, and by something Carl Jung called the projection of the shadow, the darker parts of ourselves we don't want to face. To really grasp the wars we see on the news, we need to look beyond the surface. We need to dig deeper into the hidden psychological patterns that also play out in our daily lives, in arguments with family and political divisions, in the way we size up others without even realizing it. Because in many ways, we're all fighting tiny wars every day. And here's the big question. What if we could see it? What if we could understand what's really going on beneath the surface, not just globally, but personally? What would it take to interrupt the cycle? Because ultimately, it's not just about asking why we fight. It's about learning how to stop, not just out there in the world, but inside ourselves too. Music shifts slightly. To begin unraveling this, we can't just look at modern history. We have to dig back, way back into the earliest days of humanity. For a long time, there was a romantic idea floating around known as the noble savage. Popularized by Rousseau, it painted a picture of early humans living peacefully in harmony with nature. The idea was that civilization, with its governments and hierarchies, corrupted this original state of peace. But recent archaeology tells a very different story. In War Before Civilization, archaeologist Lawrence Keeley reveals a much darker image of the past. Through countless digs across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, he documents a brutal truth: war is ancient, as old as humanity itself. The evidence is chilling. Skeletons pierced by arrows, skulls split open by blunt force, ancient villages fortified with walls and ditches, not just for show, but as real defenses against real threats. In some prehistoric cemeteries, over 20% of the remains show signs of violent death. That's not an anomaly. That's a pattern. Even early farming communities in Neolithic Europe, thousands of years before, recorded history built their homes surrounded by defensive palisades. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. Fear of attack was part of everyday life. Keeley makes an even more startling comparison. He argues that the percentage of deaths from violence in these early societies was significantly higher than in the industrialized world, even accounting for the horrors of the world wars. But war back then wasn't just about land or food. Anthropologist Pierre Clastre introduced a fascinating idea. In many indigenous societies, war was actually a tool to prevent tyranny. These groups had political systems designed to resist centralized power. Their leaders held symbolic roles but didn't have real authority. By engaging in external conflict, the group stayed internally balanced. It stopped anyone from rising too high or taking control. So in this context, war wasn't just a fight for resources. It was a way to preserve freedom. That flips a lot of our assumptions on their head. It suggests that the impulse for conflict didn't come from civilization. It may have been there all along, part of something older, deeper. At the heart of it is a psychological need, a need to define ourselves by what we're not. And to do that, we need another, an enemy, someone on the outside who helps shape who we believe we are. This has been happening for as long as humans have formed groups. War in this way doesn't just change borders, it shapes identities, beliefs, even entire mythologies. It becomes part of the story we tell about ourselves. But that leads to a more disturbing possibility. What if war isn't just a social or historical phenomenon? What if it comes from something even more intimate, something rooted inside every person? To answer that, we need to step into the world of philosophy and deep psychology. If war once started in forests and villages today, it often begins inside the human mind. Philosopher Thomas Hobbes painted a pretty grim picture of this. In Leviathan, he imagined a world where people lived without any governing power. In that natural state, he said humans were driven by fear and desire, locked in constant competition. Without rules, everyone would fight for survival. Man is a wolf to man, he wrote. To Hobbes, war wasn't the exception, it was the default. Peace, on the other hand, was a fragile construction held together only by power and fear of punishment. Then there was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who had a very different take. He believed early humans were peaceful and free, but that things fell apart when private property and social institutions emerged. That's when inequality and eventually war came into the picture. In his view, war wasn't in our nature. It was a product of civilization. But even Rousseau admitted once the thirst for power is awakened, it's hard to put it back to sleep. And then Freud took the conversation even deeper. In Civilization and Its Discontents, he introduced the idea of the death instinct, what he called thanatos. For Freud, every person carries within them a destructive force, a drive toward aggression and even self-destruction. This force doesn't vanish. It gets repressed, redirected, but eventually it surfaces through violence, hatred, and yes, through war. He described life as a constant tug-of-war between two inner forces, Eros, the drive toward love, unity, and creation, and Thanatos, the drive toward destruction. So whether we're talking about Hobbes's brutal realism, Rousseau's corrupted innocence, or Freud's deep inner conflict, a single theme keeps resurfacing. War begins within, and it's not just theory. Carl Jung added yet another layer. His idea of the shadow is central to understanding this. Each of us, Jung said, has a shadow side, a part of ourselves we repress. The fears, the impulses, the desires that don't fit with how we want to see ourselves. But just because we bury them doesn't mean they disappear. In fact, they grow stronger in the dark. And here's the catch: we often project that shadow onto others. We see in them what we refuse to see in ourselves. And that's where conflict begins. So if we're projecting our own darkness onto others, what happens next? Well, those others become more than just people with different ideas or ways of life. They become containers for everything we don't want to admit about ourselves. We turn them into enemies. We demonize them. And eventually we stop seeing them as human at all. This is what Jung was getting at with the idea of the shadow. When individuals or entire societies fail to recognize the darker parts of their psyche, those rejected parts start looking for a way out. And they often find it in projection. We point the finger outward, calling others aggressive, corrupt, evil, when in fact those are qualities we haven't faced in ourselves. And once that projection takes hold, it becomes incredibly powerful. Because now conflict doesn't feel like a choice. It feels necessary. It feels righteous. We convince ourselves that the other side deserves to be punished, that they're a threat to our values, our safety, our very identity. That's where war gets its emotional fuel. This projection mechanism isn't just some abstract idea. It has real devastating consequences. History is packed with examples. Propaganda that paints entire groups as subhuman. Posters and speeches that compare people to rats, insects, or parasites. These aren't just words. They're psychological weapons. Because once we stop seeing someone as fully human, it becomes much easier to justify violence against them. This process is called dehumanization, and it's the gateway to atrocities. Every genocide, every war fueled by ideology, every political purge, it all starts with language. Not bombs, not guns, but words. Words that reduce, simplify, strip away complexity until all that's left is an enemy to be erased. And here's the disturbing part. It works even better when people feel afraid. In times of crisis, when fear, uncertainty, and helplessness rise, so does the urge to blame someone. The more powerless we feel, the more we want a scapegoat. Someone we can direct all our pain and confusion toward. It's a way to make sense of chaos. And here's where things get even more dangerous. Because fear isn't just a reaction, it's a tool. Leaders, consciously or not, can tap into this emotional undercurrent. They can amplify it, shape it, direct it toward convenient enemies. They can create stories, narratives that frame war not as aggression, but as defense. Not as destruction, but as moral duty. To understand this manipulation, we need to look at discourse. The power of language, images, symbols, and stories that shape how we see the world. War doesn't emerge out of nowhere. It's constructed, piece by piece, sentence by sentence. Let's break that down. For one group to attack another, they need more than just weapons. They need justification. They need a story that feels true. And the best stories are the ones that don't sound like stories at all. They sound like facts. That's where national myths come in. Religious ideologies, political doctrines. These narratives don't just describe reality, they define it. They draw the lines between us and them. They declare who belongs and who threatens the group. And in these stories, the enemy isn't just someone with different ideas. They're a danger to morality, to security, even to existence itself. The more black and white the story, the more powerful it becomes. And this isn't just something from the past. Think about the Rwandan genocide, the Soviet purges, colonial conquests. Each of these was preceded by a campaign, a symbolic construction of the enemy. Posters, slogans, speeches, school lessons. The groundwork is always psychological before it's military. And today, well, the battlefield has changed. It's not just newspapers or radio anymore. It's your phone, your feed, your comment section. Social media has become a kind of enemy factory. Its algorithms are designed to favor engagement. And what gets engagement? Outrage, conflict, black and white takes, us versus them posts. So the system pushes those narratives forward again and again until they dominate the landscape. What we end up with is a fragmented hyperspeed version of the same old story. Tiny wars, digital tribes, people screaming past each other from inside bubbles that never touch. And inside each of those bubbles, the other side is twisted into a villain, a monster, a threat. We like to think of war as something official, a declaration, a battlefield, soldiers. But war in the modern world is often symbolic, psychological, carried out in language and gestures, and it seeps into everyday life. You can see it in the way people argue, the refusal to admit a mistake, the urge to humiliate rather than understand, the instinct to shut down conversations with mockery, sarcasm, or shame. These are the micro-wars of daily existence. And they're not small because they don't cause bloodshed. They're small because they hide under the surface. But they chip away at us emotionally, socially, even physically. When society operates under constant symbolic tension, it takes a toll. People become emotionally exhausted, suspicious of each other, divided. Mental health suffers. Relationships break. Trust erodes. Communities stop feeling like communities and start feeling like battlegrounds. And the worst part, we don't even realize it's happening. Because the logic of war, this way of thinking in terms of win or lose, good or evil, us or them, has become so normalized, so constant. It feels like reality, but it's not. It's a pattern, a lens. And like any lens, it can be questioned. As Jung once wrote, "What is not made conscious will be lived as fate." In other words, as long as we don't recognize these psychological forces, they'll keep controlling us. Quietly, invisibly, relentlessly. We'll keep repeating the same conflicts, the same polarizations, the same patterns of projection and blame. So the first step before peace talks, before social reform, before changing the world, is much simpler. We need to see the shadow, not just the collective one, the parts of society we push aside, but the individual one, the one inside each of us. That part we don't want to admit, the part that gets triggered in moments of conflict, the part that lashes out when it feels threatened. When we begin to notice that, really notice it, something shifts. We start seeing the other person not as a caricature, but as a complex human being. And maybe we stop needing to win so badly. We stop needing to humiliate, dominate, or destroy. We become less reactive, less defensive, less cruel. Freud believed that civilization depends on our ability to repress destructive impulses. But Jung took it further. Repression isn't enough. If we just bury the shadow, it returns louder and more violent. The only real path forward is integration. We have to bring the shadow into the light, not to indulge it, but to understand it, to accept that it exists, to recognize when it's steering the wheel. And from that awareness, something more powerful than conflict can emerge: transformation. Because once we stop projecting the enemy onto others, we start dismantling the internal structures that made that enemy necessary in the first place. So how do we actually start this process, this integration of the shadow? It begins with a very uncomfortable step: honesty. Not the kind of honesty we offer in debates or arguments, not the kind we use to prove a point, but radical internal honesty. The kind where you sit quietly and ask yourself, why did I get so angry in that conversation? Why did I feel the need to shut them down? What was I really protecting? That kind of questioning isn't easy. Most of us avoid it. It's far simpler to point the finger outward, to find flaws in others, to judge, to categorize. But when we do that, we're just strengthening the same mechanism that feeds war, the need to locate the enemy outside of ourselves. Jung warned us the shadow doesn't disappear when ignored. It grows stronger, more distorted, and eventually it bursts out in destructive ways, both personally and collectively. That's why integration is essential. It's not about becoming perfect or peaceful all the time. It's about becoming aware, about noticing the moment when fear turns into aggression, when insecurity morphs into cruelty. And this kind of awareness doesn't stop at the individual level. It has to reach the culture, because the systems we live in, the schools, the media, the politics, all shape how we think. They teach us what to fear, who to admire, who to blame. And most importantly, they reinforce narratives, stories, roles. If these systems are built on division, on us versus them, then they're not just reflecting conflict, they're producing it. So part of the work of integration is rethinking those structures. What would it look like to have an education system that teaches not only facts, but emotional literacy? That teaches students how to recognize their own projections, their own shadows, their own inner wars. What would it mean to have a media culture that doesn't thrive on outrage, but on understanding, one that highlights complexity instead of reducing everything to sound bites and sides? And what about politics? Imagine a political arena where opponents are seen not as enemies to be destroyed, but as partners in the tension of negotiation. That sounds naive, maybe, idealistic, but it's not impossible. It's just hard. Because it requires a shift not only in policy, but in consciousness. It requires us to move away from narratives of domination and control, away from zero-sum thinking, away from humiliation as a strategy, and towards something that feels riskier: vulnerability. That's the paradox. Peace doesn't come from strength in the way we usually define it. It doesn't come from bigger weapons or louder voices. It comes from the strength to be honest, to be exposed, to admit when we're wrong, to sit with discomfort instead of lashing out. But here's the thing, we're not trained to do that. We're trained to win, to succeed, to defend ourselves at all costs. That's why integration is a lifelong process. It's not something you check off a list. It's something you practice again and again, every time you catch yourself reacting out of fear instead of understanding. And it shows up in small everyday moments. That argument with your coworker, that impulse to belittle someone online, that tight feeling in your chest when someone challenges your worldview. Those are opportunities, not to prove yourself, but to know yourself, to see your shadow at work, and maybe, just maybe, to respond differently. It's in those tiny shifts that something bigger begins to change. Because if enough people start noticing these patterns in themselves, the collective energy begins to shift. The narratives start to lose their grip. The old ways of thinking us versus them, conquer or be conquered, start to feel tired, heavy, outdated, and new stories can begin. Stories that make space for contradiction, for doubt, for complexity. That doesn't mean conflict disappears. It means we stop turning conflict into war. Because here's the truth. Conflict is part of life. It's inevitable. People will disagree. Tensions will rise. Needs will clash. But how we handle that conflict is what makes all the difference. War begins when we stop seeing the other as human. Peace begins when we start seeing the shadow as our own. And we don't have to wait for world leaders to make that change. We can start with ourselves, with the language we use, the stories we tell, the way we frame disagreement. We can start by noticing when we're tempted to reduce someone to a label, a stereotype, a threat, and asking, what am I really afraid of? Because fear is always there underneath it all. The fear of being wrong, the fear of being powerless, the fear of not belonging, the fear of the unknown. And the shadow feeds on that fear. It whispers that the world is dangerous, that you must protect yourself, that someone else is the reason you feel this way. And if you can just defeat them, everything will be okay. But it never is, because the true threat isn't out there. It's the part of us that believes in enemies, that needs them, that creates them again and again to avoid facing our own wounds. So maybe the most radical act we can take is to pause, to reflect, to notice, and to ask, what part of me am I projecting onto the other? That's not just a psychological question. It's a spiritual one, a cultural one, a political one. Because the more we understand the dynamics of the shadow, or the more we see them everywhere in the news, in our relationships, in our reactions, in our history. And we start to realize something powerful: the battlefield is not out there. It never was. The real war is within our fears, our assumptions, our habits of thought. And if we want to change the world, we have to start there. Music becomes hopeful. This path isn't easy. It demands courage, patience, humility. It means giving up the comfort of certainty, the rush of moral superiority, the simplicity of good versus evil. But what we get in return is clarity. We begin to see ourselves and others not as perfect, but as whole. As flawed, yes, but also capable of growth, of connection, of transformation. And that changes everything. Because once we stop needing to win all the time, we can start listening. Once we stop fearing the shadow, we can start healing. Once we stop projecting the enemy, we can start building something different. Not a utopia, not a perfect society, but a more conscious one. One where conflict doesn't always have to end in violence. Where disagreement isn't a threat. Where difference isn't a cause for war. And that's not just a dream. It's a choice, a practice, a daily commitment. To face the shadow, to own it, to integrate it, and in doing so, to finally break the cycle that has kept humanity trapped for so long. So now we've arrived at the final stretch. If war is an expression of unconscious drives of fear and projection, and if the true battleground lies within us, then the question becomes, what now? What do we do with this awareness? Recognizing the shadow is only the beginning. The real challenge is integration. And integration isn't about eliminating the dark impulses. It's about acknowledging them, observing them without judgment, and making conscious choices that are no longer ruled by fear or instinct. And that's a path that doesn't follow shortcuts. Each of us has to walk it one moment at a time. Each person must face their own reactions, beliefs, and resentments. We need to learn how to pause when we feel the urge to lash out, how to reflect when we're tempted to demonize someone who disagrees, and how to ask ourselves, where is this coming from? What part of me feels threatened? What part of me is trying to protect something vulnerable? And instead of reacting automatically, we begin to respond intentionally. With awareness, with honesty. Jung said it clearly, the shadow doesn't just vanish. It has to be worked with, brought into dialogue, integrated into the conscious self. And that process begins every time we notice our own thoughts during conflict. Every time we choose not to speak with contempt. Every time we listen instead of escalating. It's not flashy work, it's not dramatic, but it matters. It accumulates. The way we resolve a tense moment at work, the way we soften during a tough conversation, the way we choose not to add fuel to an argument online. These may seem like tiny actions, but they shape the atmosphere around us. They shift the emotional climate, and over time they begin to change culture. Because the war logic, the idea that every disagreement must end with winners and losers, only survives when we keep feeding it, when we keep living inside it without realizing there's another way. So how do we shift out of that logic? It's not about silencing our emotions. It's not about pretending we're always calm or kind. It's about becoming conscious, so that even when anger rises, it doesn't take the wheel. Even when fear surfaces, it doesn't hijack our perspective. And beyond the individual, this awareness needs to ripple out into education, into storytelling, into how we shape the next generation's view of conflict. Imagine growing up in a world where children are taught to observe their emotional reactions, to name them, to understand that hostility is often a mask for pain, that aggression can be a cover for insecurity, that the enemy is often a mirror. What kind of adults would that produce? And what kind of society? One where conflict doesn't disappear, but where it doesn't escalate into war. One where we can disagree without dehumanizing, where we can argue without annihilating, where the goal isn't to dominate, but to understand. Of course, this kind of cultural shift isn't easy. It asks a lot. It requires that we rewrite the stories we tell in media, in politics, in religion, even in the stories we whisper to ourselves late at night. It means we need to stop romanticizing war as a path to glory or identity. We need to stop clinging to narratives that tell us peace is weakness or that compromise is betrayal. And we need to start building stories that embrace nuance, that hold space for paradox, that accept complexity. This is what peace education can look like, not just the absence of violence, but the presence of self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and mutual respect. It's not about repressing what we feel, but expanding our capacity to respond in ways that don't deepen the divide. The more someone is in touch with their own inner life, the less likely they are to project it onto others. The more you reconcile with your own shadow, the less you need to see the enemy outside you. And the less you contribute consciously or not to the cycle of division. But let's be real. This isn't a utopia. We're not talking about perfect harmony. Conflict will never fully disappear, nor should it. Conflict can be creative. It can bring growth, challenge, transformation. The goal isn't to erase it, but to relate to it differently. To stop treating every disagreement like a battle, to stop needing an enemy to feel strong, to stop building our identity on the rejection of others, because that's what war really is, a distortion of identity. A fear that leads us to believe we must destroy the other to survive. But once we see that fear, once we name it, we can stop being ruled by it. That's where real change begins, not with treaties, not with declarations, but with consciousness, with people who are willing to look inward, to question their certainty, to sit with discomfort instead of attacking it, to tell stories that heal instead of divide. People like you. Because if you've made it this far, you're already part of that process. You're already asking the deeper questions. You're already stepping outside the easy narratives. And that's where the transformation starts. Right here, right now. In the way you choose to speak, the way you choose to listen, the way you choose to live. It's not dramatic, it's not grand, but it's powerful. Because every time we make a more conscious choice, we chip away at the old story. The story of war, the story of enemies, the story of separation. And we begin writing a new one. One where strength isn't measured by domination, but by awareness. Where peace isn't an illusion, but a skill. Where humanity isn't something we protect from others, but something we cultivate with them. Music rises softly hopeful. So as we close, remember this. The true battlefield isn't out there, not in the trenches, not in the headlines, not even in politics. It's within. Within our reactions, our relationships, our beliefs. The fight isn't about beating the other. It's about seeing them and seeing ourselves clearly, honestly, fully. Because when we stop fighting ourselves, we stop needing to fight the world. And that maybe more than anything else is how the war ends.